The Napoleonic Wars lasted for 12 years, from 1803 to 1815, and somewhere in the range of 3.5 million to 6 million people died as a result. Now, we're talking about civilian and military casualties and war-related diseases, but up to 2 million soldiers died on the field of battle. What do you do with that many bodies? Well, in 1812, a French general was leading a retreat from Moscow, and this is his eyewitness account at Borodino, 2 months after the battle was done. He said, and I quote, "We marched on, absorbed in thought, when some of us, raising our eyes, uttered a cry of horror. Each one instantly looked about him, and there lay stretched before us a plain, trampled, bare, and devastated. All the trees cut down within a few feet from the surface, and farther off, craggy hills. The ground around us was everywhere covered with fragments of helmets and breastplates, broken drums, gun stocks, tatters of uniforms, and standards red with blood. On this desolate spot lay 30,000 half-devoured corpses, while a pile of skeletons on the summit of one of the hills overlooked the whole. It seems as though death had here fixed his throne." In this video, we're going to visit another valley strewn with the bones of dead bodies, and we will see how God can bring the dead back to life and create a vast army. I am Jim Taylor, and welcome to In Favor Resources, and to the last video, the final one, number 14, in this series titled, "We Are an Army in Indiana." That's based on a prophecy given to our state by Chuck Pierce. And so if God sees us that way, we are drawing points of comparison and lessons from successful armies in history, in Israel, in America, and in Indiana, because those things are true about us as well, if God sees us as an army. So I'm going to ask you to download for the last time the handout for this one, video number 14, infavorresources.com. And at the very beginning of this series, I told you that God had highlighted 2 passages to me before I even started. And we began with the first one, with Isaiah 13, where the Lord was mustering an army for war in Indiana and how he does that. Well, this last video, we are prophesying a vast army in Indiana. This is the concluding video. And we're going to be walking through the second of these passages, which is Ezekiel 37, and it's printed right there toward the top of your handout. I'd ask you to follow along, and you have the gist of my comments actually printed below that and on the back. So this compelling story appears in a series of visions and prophecies and prophetic acts performed by the prophet Ezekiel. This particular vision describes how God can take a graveyard and turn it and transform it into a vast army, which is a phrase, by the way, we've heard several times in this series, and I've commented on that. But usually that vast army is the opponent. It's on the other side. Well, let's begin with verse 1 here. "It was the hand of the Lord upon Ezekiel that began it all." That's in verse 1. That same hand, that same phrase, that same expression enabled Elijah to outrun a chariot in 1 Kings 18 and caused Elisha to prophesy about another valley in 2 Kings 3. And that phrase, "the hand of the Lord was upon me," occurs 7 times in this book, the book of Ezekiel, 7 times when God is speaking to him in an unusual way. Ezekiel continues, "The Spirit of the Lord brought him out and set him in the middle of a valley where the prophet was greeted by a gruesome sight." That sight was that the valley was full of dead men's bones. And notice it says, "There were a great many of them," in verse 2. And then in verse 3, I mean, if you can just imagine the bones as far as your eye can see. And verse 3 says they were very dry. So this had not been a recent disaster at all. It was the result of a long process of death and decay. They were once corpses, but their flesh had rotted or been eaten away, and the bones had dried in the weather and been bleached by the sun, and then had been scattered by scavengers. They were parched. This is what Ezekiel beheld. It was a scene of death, and it had been that way for a long, long time. Moving on then. It was in these circumstances that God asked Ezekiel what appears to be a ridiculous question. He says, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Well, what must Ezekiel have thought? He might have said, "I don't think so, Lord. Are you kidding? Are you serious?" Of course not. But his answer was a restrained one. He acknowledged his own helplessness, and he made allowance for God's power when he said, "Lord, you alone know." Now that was the safe answer. It was a good answer. It was a smart answer because only God could know, and only God could do something about it. So God enlisted Ezekiel's help in this impossible task. And the Lord commanded the prophet to, and I'm quoting here, prophesy to these bones in verse 4. And this is what he was to say to them, again in verse 4. Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. And Ezekiel obeyed. God spoke to Ezekiel, and Ezekiel spoke to the bones, which, by the way, had no ears and could not hear, but he still obeyed God. He did what God told him to do. He told the bones that the Lord would give them tendons and flesh and skin and would give them breath and life, verses 5 and 6. Now, as Ezekiel was speaking, while he was prophesying to the bones, it happened. There was a noise, a rattling sound as the bones came together, verse 7. As the Lord had said, tendons and flesh and skin appeared, verse 8. And the bones turned into skeletons, and then the skeletons became bodies. And that's an improvement. They certainly looked much better, but there was a problem. They were still dead, we're told in verse 8. There was no breath in them. As before, Ezekiel is told to prophesy, saying to the bones what the Lord said to him. This is verse 9. Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, these dead ones now, so that they may live. And once again, the prophet obeyed, and again it happened just as God said it would. Verse 10 says, breath entered them, and they came to life, and they stood up on their feet. Whoa, that must have been quite a sight. But it's that final phrase that really speaks to us in Indiana. They didn't just stand up. It says they stood up, a vast army. God had finished his work. He used Ezekiel's prophetic words to reassemble the scattered remains that had lain on this battlefield for a long, long time, for ages perhaps, and to reanimate the dead bodies. But this wasn't a zombie apocalypse. This wasn't some confused and aimless rabble clacking around. God had taken a graveyard and transformed it into a vast army, an exceedingly great military force for the day of the Lord. You've probably heard that old song, inspired by this story, Ezekiel's experience. Ezekiel connected them dry bones. Now hear the word of the Lord. Them bones going to walk around. Now hear the word of the Lord. Or the more modern version, skeleton bones stand at the sound of eternity on the lips of the found. And gravestones roll to the rhythm of the sound of you. We want your blood to flow inside our body. We want your wind inside our lungs. Skeleton bones stand at the sound of eternity on the lips of the found. Now, at the bottom there, for the last time, we left some space for your thoughts and questions and applications and implications about this amazing prophetic phrase, we are an army in Indiana. So, in our state, we may have been asleep. We may have been in a coma. We may have been even spiritually dead. And it may have been for a year, it may have been for decades, it might have been for a lifetime. The church in Indiana may sometimes and in some places appear to be desiccated and dead. And it may be. But God is asking us the question, son of man, daughter, can these bones live? Can these bones in Indiana live? That's why in my books and in these videos, we are stirring up these past prophecies like Paul told Timothy to do. We are prophesying over Indiana like God told Ezekiel to do in this valley. We are prophesying life into the people, the families, the churches of Indiana, into seniors, into adults, couples, singles, teens, children. And the bones become skeletons, but that's not far enough. Remember Dutch Sheets said about Indiana, there's short circuits. You need to go all the way. So the bones become skeletons, and the skeletons become bodies, but we're not done yet because the bodies then come to life, but that's still not the goal. The goal is for them to stand up as a vast army. And in Indiana, we are that army. Believe it, pray it, press into it, prophesy it, expect it, and celebrate it. I just want to say two things in closing. Well, three things. First of all, thank you. For those of you who have been through this entire series, I'm sure that God will bless you for your suffering. But secondly, I just want to say you can have all this material, the 12 declarations with a lot more stories, scripture, songs, a lot more quotes and encouraging words and so forth. You can have a chapter about the God who fights for you. There's additional army prophecies gathered, Hebrew and Greek words for army, some short stories about Hoosier Medal of Honor winners. All of that is available in the book that these videos led up to, which is Seeing Indiana the Way That God Sees Us. We are an army in Indiana. And this is just the proof copy that I'm finding all the mistakes in, but by the time you see this video and the time it's posted, this book should be available on Amazon.com or from me, the author, through InFavorResources.com. But finally, just in conclusion, I want to say we are an army in Indiana. God says so. So onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war. God bless.